Okay, so in your papers that you wrote at the very beginning of the semester, one of the things that came up over and over was that nobody knew what World War I was about. And this is fair. It's a very complicated war and kind of an unusual one. And so what I decided to do was to do just essentially a brief overview of who was in World War I and what happened and why it was unusual and how it sort of changed the course of history and set the stage for World War II. So it's going to be a weird one today, but it's essentially just kind of an overview of everything that happened in World War I, and especially not like the battles and the battle sites and the dates, but like big picture, like what was going on at home, what was going on worldwide. So buckle up, because it's a weird one today. So here we go. World War I. And this is unfortunately an extremely long slideshow, so here we go. All right. Let's start with the reasons for the war. So essentially, leading up to essentially 1914, like in the last part of the 1800s and in the first part of the 1900s, one of the major things that was happening was the Industrial Revolution. So basically, society was changing in that regard, but there was some other stuff happening too. So we are going to talk about these 5 things, which are sort of the like generally acknowledged causes for the war. So number 1, imperialism. So imperialism is when like you as a country decide that you would like to own other countries, usually because you want their resources, but also just because like you feel like it. Nationalism is the second one, and nationalism is very often a result of imperialism or sort of a response to imperialism. And the idea behind nationalism is we want our own country, like we are our own people ethnically or linguistically or culturally, and we want our own piece of land so that we can like live how we want. As you can imagine, those two are very often in contention. The third one is militarism. So one of the results of the Industrial Revolution was that we started making really, really big weapons. Previously, you know, we had talked about how the Civil War was kind of the last war where we saw a lot of like hand-to-hand combat, and we did have muskets, but we didn't have the kind of things that we're going to see today. The fourth one is a mutual defense alliance. And what that means is that you and another country form an alliance, and essentially if somebody attacks that country, you fight back. So it's like you and your friends have formed like a clique. And so basically if that country gets in trouble, you come with them. And the fifth thing, of course, was the assassination of our boy Franz Ferdinand. So I have a couple of pictures just to kind of show you what's going on here. So this is the first one. This is imperialism. So one of the major things that was happening, especially in the late 1800s, was that white people had remembered Africa. And what they decided to do was go down and just divide Africa amongst themselves. So this is like peak, you know, white guy entitlement, right? So basically they went through, and even though there were already people there and they had drawn their own lines and they had been there for thousands of years, they went in and redrew some new lines based on what they wanted. So you can see the way that Africa is divided in this picture. Basically, they were like, this part is France now, and this part is England now. As you may recall in your other history classes, that didn't work out great, but this is kind of one of the things that was happening. Basically, the world powers were just like kind of glomming up other pieces of land and deciding that this was their thing now. So the other thing that we talked about was nationalism. And this was one of the big problems that was kind of going on in regard to this thing. So if you look at this, this is a drawing of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I'm not going to go super deep into like how this got here and essentially what happened in regard to like the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian Empire, but basically this is where we're at the beginning of World War I. And the real problem was down here. So Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, they basically didn't want to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were like, look, we're not like y'all. Like, we're Slavic, and we want to go back with our Slavic friends and have our own Slavic nation and speak our own Slavic language, and like, we're not Austrian. And Austria was like, yes, you are. And they were like, no, we're not, and that was a problem. Then, militarism. So again, one of the things that was like a big, massive change was that we built factories, and with those factories we could build like real big fuck off guns, and this is one of them. So this gun was called the Paris gun, and it was developed in Germany, and it was so big that it had to be dragged around on railroad tracks, but it could shoot a mortar 80 miles. So you didn't have to be like next to the people that you were fighting anymore. You could be like really far away. It wasn't very accurate. You could shoot at like a city, but you couldn't shoot at like a very specific thing. So you could shoot Paris, but you couldn't shoot like their ammunition stockpile. So it wasn't the best ever gun, but it certainly could shoot a very long way. So it was very exciting. So in part, a lot of this war had to do with people really wanting to play with their new toys. The alliances was the other thing that I was explaining a minute ago. And I apologize for the blurriness of this picture, but I think it's essentially the best representation in terms of just putting it in colors and seeing the overlap. So we have two main groups going on. The Triple Entente, which is a great name for a band. That's over here, Russia, France, Britain. And basically they had formed alliances based on trade and based on marriage. And we're going to see the marriage thing happen here in a minute. And then on the other side, we have the Triple Alliance, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and Germany. So one thing that's important to remember is that these green guys, they're all sort of next to each other, and these blue guys are all sort of far apart. That's going to become important later. And there's other countries that are sort of stuck in the middle. So here's a sort of an easier way of imagining this. All of the countries in pink, this is the Triple Alliance. And then these countries in blue, that's the Triple Entente. So essentially, these countries had to get involved because the war was already happening like in their backyard. And then these other countries had to get involved because the war was happening to their friends that they had an alliance with. So basically they had already formed these alliances, and then that became a real problem, essentially, when the Serbians were like, no, seriously, give us back Croatia. And Austria-Hungary was like, no. So that was essentially one of the big problems, which leads us to our final problem, which was this guy. So this was the Archduke, and he wasn't like necessarily the most powerful guy in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he was up there, and he was an important member of the royal family. And so the Serbians, who had this anarchist group called the Black Hand, which is also a great name for an anarchist group, they got together and they were like, you know what we should do is we should kill this dude to make a point of how we want our own country. This is the nationalism part again. And they did. Well, they missed the first time, that's the whole thing, but basically, once he got stuck in traffic, they found him again, and they shot him, and that's his wife, Sophie. She was very nice. And it was a problem. So that's essentially where we're at. Those are the 5 sort of big things that are leading up to what's going on here. But worldwide, there were also bigger social changes. So first, we're going to talk about Germany, because Germany's really going like through some shit, right? So the main thing that was going on in Germany was that they were experiencing this like massive cultural overhaul. So the Industrial Revolution hit hard in Germany. They were like prepared for this. This was their jam. They were already so efficient and so focused on education and so focused on practicality that like once they got machines, they were like on top of it. So Germany was basically shifting their ideals. They were going, if you've read your Durkheim, from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. So essentially they were going from a whole series of like villages where you knew everybody, you know, it's like all best friends, to like cities where you're just surrounded by strangers and you don't even know your neighbors and you work 12 hours a day. So basically they're going through this massive cultural shift, and this was a thing because basically they were changing not just the way that they went to work, but the way that they lived. So their whole idea of like who they were was changing, and their idea of what was important was changing, and that's vital. And also this is a map of the German Empire at this point in history, and you'll notice that it does extend to the east more than it does these days. But one of the things that I wanted to show you was all of these little tiny baby states. So what had happened in Germany in the last couple decades prior to this war was unification. So if you've ever read, you know how those old fairy tales, like basically everyone is a princess, and you're like, how could they possibly all be princesses? This is why, because you could just have a kingdom that was like 30 square miles, like no problem. So there were a bunch of separate kingdoms and a bunch of separate kings and princes and that sort of thing. And they had only recently sort of united into one thing. So Germany was like reinventing themselves. And the other problem with Germany was that they had this bitch at the helm. So Kaiser Wilhelm, he's a problem. So he was a monarch in the old style of monarchs, which is to say he got born, like he didn't earn it or anything. And he was a really problematic monarch for personal reasons, because he was sort of raised the like treasured dumpling baby of his mother, and he was like kind of delicate. And they tried to expose him to like hardship, but it didn't really take. So he knew that he needed to pretend to be masculine. So he was like obsessed with his own masculinity, and he was constantly wearing his war uniform, even like to dinner, and they were like, you don't need to wear that here. And he was like, look at me. And he was just super dramatic, and he had a really short attention span. And so constantly he would tell his maids to do something, and then they would do it. And then he would come back and be like, why have you done this thing? And they're like, you told us. And he's like, no, I didn't, you know, and then he would kill them. It was a problem. So he was just a really, really bad leader. And also he was super gay, which wasn't inherently a problem, except that you weren't allowed to be gay at the time. So they had to keep like assassinating his boyfriends, which, as you can imagine, upset him. So Wilhelm, a whole lot of problems. But the other thing that's important to remember about Wilhelm himself and like everybody else who's involved, all of these dudes are cousins. So in Western Europe at the time, it was common practice to intermarry your families. So if you, like Queen Victoria, is all of their grandma, if you, like Queen Victoria, had a whole bunch of babies, you would just sort of spread them out in different European empires, and they would become the kings and queens of those places because they would marry the kings and queens of those places. So essentially, all of these guys are related. And so they brought not just like their country's sort of ideals to this, but also, like, for instance, Wilhelm was obsessed with his uncle Bertie because he thought that his uncle Bertie disapproved of him. And Bertie did disapprove of him because Wilhelm, as I mentioned, was a dramatic bitch. And so basically he's bringing not just his country's feelings, but like his personal feelings into this war, and that's going to be a problem. Oh, by the way, sorry, this is Bertie. Typically when you ascend to the British throne, you take on a new name. All right, so in Germany, they're sort of going through this thing where they're like, you know, we have improved ourselves, we have united, we have invented the Industrial Revolution. Maybe we should share all of this gorgeous stuff with the world. Like, maybe we should just take over and bring them freedom and democracy. Like, stop me when this sounds familiar, right? But basically they were like, what if we just have a real quick war? Like, no problem, it's gonna take like 2 weeks. We're just gonna be like, bomb, 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 and then we're gonna take over Europe. You know, and then Europe's going to be great because we have the best culture. We have the best schools, the best education, the best art, the best operas. Like, why don't we just go ahead and take over the world and like make it better? So that's kind of what was going on with Germany at the time. This is one of their propaganda posters. They have the best.
Yeah, is that a like champagne ad?
No. It's an ad for the army, but the idea is if you join the army, everything's going to be so chill that like when we finish fighting at 5 o'clock, we'll have champagne.
Right. Okay. Because Sekt is German for like champagne, so I'm like, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah, they're basically like, once we finish this, we'll have some champagne, and the idea was we'll finish this like by Tuesday. And they meant it. They really thought this was definitely gonna be the case.
That also sounds familiar.
Yeah, right.
I feel like we're gonna hear that a lot.
We're gonna hear that next time too. So the German soldiers sort of familiarly were called Heinies, which I think is hilarious because essentially the idea was that all of their names were Heinrich. And so they called them the Heinies, and that's going to come up in your movie that you're going to see in a minute. And so they were super dedicated because everybody had to serve. Every man between 17 and 45 had to participate in some way. They didn't all have to go to the front, but they all had to do something. So like every single male person in Germany was involved in this war, and they all thought they were going to win, no problem. But also they were sort of like automatons. They just like they participated, but they weren't sure why. So this quote I thought was actually pretty genius. I never saw a German soldier, however employed, who did not seem to know exactly what he was doing. And I never saw one who seemed to know why he was doing it. And this is going to be crucial as the war goes on. They follow orders, no problem. They believe that strength comes from following, which is an amazing turn of phrase. But basically, the idea is the most, the person who follows orders the best is the best person. So as you can imagine, this created a gorgeous army, completely efficient and all the way in line and like never talked back. Like this was a great thing for making an army, but not a great thing for making people. So on the other side, we have England. So England is not like blameless in all this. They're going to be the other main character. And basically what's going on with England right now prior to this war is colonialism. So England was like super into imperialism, super into colonialism. They had taken over a lot of the world. Like if you look at this map, all those pink parts are England at this point in history. And that's not something to sneeze at. Like that's pretty impressive. Like they've got whole continents. So England was basically like, listen, this is going really well for us, and we do not want to cede power, and we do not want to cede oil reserves or diamond reserves, both of which they had taken over in Africa. So they were basically like, look, we're not like eager to go to war. It's just that we will if we have to. So they thought of war as kind of a gentlemanly sport. It was like, look, we'll show up, we'll stand shoulder to shoulder, we'll take turns shooting as we did previously, remember? And then, you know, we'll go home, but it'll be really dignified and it'll be full of justice. And in the end, England will win because England wins everything all the time. Again, not wrong. So basically this is their propaganda. And as you can see, it's a lot more chill. They're guilting you, to be sure. They're basically like, there's a place for you, but they're not like aggressive, like, and then we're going to take over the whole world. So England was like, you know, they're taking part. Their soldiers were called Tommies, and this is sort of short for Tommy Atkins, and it's sort of like an American G.I. Joe. Like it's just sort of this nickname that they have for every single soldier. And the British soldiers were not nearly as dedicated as the American soldiers. They were there, but they were like, the first wave of them were a little bit more dedicated. They were all professional soldiers, but they all died real fast, which we'll see in a second. So the second and third waves of them were like 15-year-old boys and like 50-year-old men. So as the war went on, they became less and less like engaged in kind of what was going on here. So their soldiers were not as like orderly and efficient as the German soldiers, which was a bit of a problem. We'll see. All right, so that's the stage. Basically, there's a couple of really, really big world powers. They're dividing up the rest of the world amongst themselves, and some of them have alliances with other ones. All right, so then, June 28th, 1914, the Serbians shoot Franz Ferdinand. So again, the Serbians were really mad about Bosnia and Croatia. They wanted them back, and they wanted to have like their own unified country instead of being like swallowed up by Austria-Hungary. So they shot the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, and people got real pissed. Real pissed, because you're not allowed to just assassinate people, especially like out in the street. Like that's like you like this is like you want a war, like we'll give you a war, bitch. And that's what happened. So basically Austria-Hungary was like, well, we can't let this slide, like we're gonna go to war, like come at me, But the problem with that was that they were sort of right next to a lot of other countries. So for instance, they were right next to Germany, and Germany was like, well, and then they realized that they had to get involved because not only are they allied with Austria-Hungary, but also the Serbians have Russia, and Russia was gigantic and super powerful. So basically the Serbians started it, Austria-Hungary threw the second punch, and everybody else had to sort of like get involved. So everybody else was like, all right, fine, like I guess we're in war. So Russia wasn't like super into this, but they were like, whatever, like we'll back you up. Everybody else was kind of super into this. France wasn't. They never really got super into this, to be fair, but they were allied with the other countries, so they sort of got dragged into it, And Germany basically was super into it. They love war, and everybody else wanted to sort of squash them. So essentially the war was about keeping Germany and Austria-Hungary sort of like disempowered, because if they got too much power, they were just going to take over everything, and Britain didn't want that because Britain wanted all the power. So basically they got involved because their friends got involved. All right, so here we are, we're at war. So the first part of the war was really, really fast. So in the olden days, like for instance, the Revolutionary War took months to get off the ground. The Civil War too, really like took several months to get off the ground. But in this war, everybody was like, oh, you want to go to war? We'll go to war. And they were at war by the end of the month. Like it was like, pew, pew, pew. They got on all of their trains, and to be fair, they had a lot of technology that the other wars didn't have. But they got on all their trains, they sent all their telegrams, and they were at war like no problem, like 4 weeks later. So basically he got shot in June, and then in July, everybody was like, ah. And then starting in August, war. By the end of August, everybody was there. So it was the fastest start to a war we had seen yet, in part because everybody was like, we're going to do this. It's going to be done. Like we'll be home, by November. But in part, that's what they thought. So basically, everybody arrived from all over Europe to two fronts. Either they were on the Western Front over here in France, which should sound familiar to you soon, or they were on the Eastern Front over here on the sort of eastern side of Austria-Hungary next to Russia. So basically, either side of Austria-Hungary and Germany was at war. So they had sort of surrounded themselves with battles, which is going to be a problem later. And I wanted to show you this because sometimes I think we forget how small Western Europe is. So that's the battlefront, fits right there in the middle of America. We could have had 3 in America. America's gigantic. All right. So for the first couple of months, it's epic. It's everything that they dreamed that it would be. They just shoot, 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 and they shoot, shoot, shoot. And so many people died. It didn't go anything like they thought it would in terms of like a quick, easy victory. It went a lot like they thought it would in terms of like, wow, our guns are effective. But basically, just death on death on death on death on death. So all of the professional soldiers died within the first couple of months. So basically, the teams that they went into war with lost quite quickly. And we'll see why in a second, but basically so many people died. The Germans lost 1 million people in the first 5 months, 1 million in the first couple months. So basically the war got off to a really fast start, and it got off to a really like intense battle start, but it didn't finish quite when they thought it would. So they start in August, and they fight, and they fight. But as it turns out, it's not fun. Surprise. But again, in your book, this will become sort of clear. Like they were told that it would be fun, and they were told that it would be quick. Again, similar to the Civil War. But then when they got there, they were like, oh, this is terrible. Winter set in, and it rained all the time, and it snowed all the time, and they were in these trenches, which we'll talk about here in a second. So basically all of these boys, you know, had gone to war, and they're like, this is gonna kick ass, y'all. And then they get there and they're just sitting in puddles for 4 days at a time, right? Or dying. So one of the things that started to happen was that people, very much like the Civil War, started to die from things other than shooting. So in the first couple months, most of the people just died from getting shot, but in the next couple months, people started to die from frostbite and from rheumatism and from trench foot, which is exactly as gross as it sounds. And so again, kind of similar to the Civil War, people are dying from war, but not necessarily from battle. They're dying from like conditions in war. So we're going to talk about trench warfare pretty extensively, but I wanted to show you these pictures just in case. So this is kind of what they did. So they would dig these little holes into the ground that were deep enough that you could like kind of poke your head out if you wanted to, but otherwise you would be completely covered. Because for the most part, they were fighting on this really flat land. So basically there'd be a gigantic field, and then on each side you would have these little trenches. And so the trenches, in theory, were kind of a good idea. Like you had, you know, you would sort of shore up the sides with like bricks and sandbags. And there would be sort of like levels, like you could hide in the dugout if you were getting bombed, and you could like climb back up if you weren't. There were parapets. But as you can see, it was also a shitty place to be. And I don't know why they didn't think about this, but when it rained, it just puddled in the trenches. And so that was a problem too. So trench warfare makes sense to an extent, but also literally the dumbest way to fight. So what happened was that the soldiers got really disheartened. They were like, man, like we thought this would be cool. Like we thought we would come here and we would kill some bad guys and then we would go home and we'd get a parade. And instead, like we came here, 9 out of my 10 friends died and I'm cold and wet all the time. And so one of the things that started to happen was that they started to look at the soldiers on the other side and they were like, oh, hold up. Those are also disenchanted 19-year-olds. You know what I mean? Like they started thinking like, oh, this is not what they said it was going to be. And those guys are just like us. Those guys are just dudes, you know? And so they started to sort of loosen the bounds. They started stealing a lot from the army itself and from each other. Sorry. They started fraternizing. Like they started hanging out with each other, sort of like undercover. They started sharing cigarettes and stuff like that. And then Christmas. So this is kind of a famous event in like war history because it's unprecedented that we know of. We haven't seen anything like it since, to be sure. So it's important to remember that Germans love Christmas and they celebrate Christmas like really pagan. It kind of alarms a lot of other people, but like the Germans invented the whole tree thing with the candles and a lot of songs, and like people didn't used to celebrate Christmas like that, but the way that Germans celebrate Christmas is really fun, so we stole a lot of it in America. So on Christmas, they basically called a truce, which nobody knew they could do, but they can, I guess, because they're just making this shit up as they go. So they called a truce and they just took the entirety of Christmas Eve and Christmas Day and the next day off. They just like took the day off. And they hung out and they sang songs and they played football. They had church services. They had Catholic services and Protestant services.
I'm guessing they were fraternizing with the enemy as well.
Yeah, because they basically were just like, yeah, it's Christmas.
I mean, why not at that point? It's a break.
And they needed a break. I'm sorry. So basically, they were so disillusioned, and then they got there, and it was terrible, and then they just like took a break for Christmas, which we have never done since, because it ended up really changing their idea about how they thought about the war and changing how they thought about the enemy. So it was a major turning point, because they went from, we have to fight these strangers who are not like us, to like, oh no, they are like us, and I have to kill them tomorrow. So in some places they didn't. Some places they kept the truce going until like January, which is hilarious. But in other places they're basically like, all right, so like 3, 2, 1, back at war. So they went back to their trenches and started again. So, okay. So this is some of the stuff in regard to militarism. So as we talked about a little bit last week, the Civil War was the last war of its kind. It was the last war where everybody walked everywhere. It was the last war where there was like hand-to-hand combat. It was the last war where you had to like sort of eat as you went. So starting now, we start to get a lot of changes that are pretty epic, but also that make it very impersonal. So first, let's talk about trench warfare. So like I said, trench warfare, just a real dumb way to fight. But basically what happened was you went on rotation. So for 4 days, you were at the front lines, you were at the very front in the trenches. And then for 4 days, you were in sort of the middle trenches, and then you got 4 days off. So everybody's on this like 4-4-4 rotation. everybody who lives through the first part. So basically, you never really got to escape. Like, you would get 4 days off, but you would spend 8 days cold and wet and getting shot at and hungry. And there's all this disease, and there's all of these rats, and there's all this lice. Actually, let me show you this picture. That terrier right here got a special medal for war efforts, which, yeah, fair enough, that's a lot of rats. So the trenches were awful. They were infested with vermin. They were infested with disease. Like, everybody is, you know, sharing. Well, the Spanish plague is about, the Spanish flu is about to happen, back and forth with each other, and the rats keep eating their food. And so, as you can imagine, they weren't feeling super inspired. You know, this was a long winter. They're stuck here, and they only ever go like 1,000 feet. You know, and so it was a very dark sort of way to fight. It was a very dark period in history because all of these guys were stuck and they couldn't go back home. So trench warfare had a lot of problems. And in the middle was no man's land. So again, they're sort of on a big field, trenches over here, and in the middle of this big flat spot, which you may recall if you've seen Wonder Woman. So the space between, technically you weren't supposed to go there, except that they had invented a sort of like style where at night you could send your medics out and they could collect all of your dead or close to dead and bring them back. So no man's land was literally just a bare patch in the middle that they bombed all to hell. You can still go look at it if you want. Here's a picture. So this one is Flanders Fields, which was one of the like most popular sort of trench warfare sites. And it used to be a forest and they just destroyed it. And nobody can really do anything with that land anymore either because there's so many cannonballs and like mortar shells and like there's a bunch of just human garbage still there. So trench warfare, not ideal, not ideal. We've never done it since, which I think is good evidence that it was a dumb way to fight. Okay, so there were some other changes too. So one of the first is the style, like the sort of schedule of fighting. So they did this over and over and over, and nobody moved and nobody went anywhere. And so they essentially just developed like a schedule. So basically you would wake up, first light, eat your breakfast, and then start shooting back and forth. And you would try to destroy the other person's like barbed wire and like, you know, like, what do they call them? Like the barricades and that sort of thing. And if you did destroy some barricades, you would get out on your tummy and sort of like crawl forward and then try to shoot the other guy's barricades. Then at dark, you would stop. And then the medics could go out into the field and collect all your dead people and bring them back. And then you would take the night off. And then the next morning you would start again. So it was like almost on its own little schedule there for a while. So again, trench warfare, very stupid. But they sort of got used to this. This was like the way that they were used to fighting. Like, okay, you're over here, I'm over here, pew, 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 and then we go to bed. The problem was that Germany sort of looked at this and they were like, oh, wow, this is not going well. And so Germany was like, you know what we're going to do is we're just going to change the rules of war. And on the one hand, fair enough, the rules of war were clearly very stupid. On the other hand, borderline evil, right? So basically they invent a new style of warfare. And the name for this is Transvaluation, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's essentially changing the way that you evaluate success. So the Germans decided that instead of winning by defense, they would win by offense. So instead of bombing the fuck out of everybody and being like, haha, I got you, they would like peck, 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 and then stay alive longer than everybody else. So essentially they changed from defeating via offense to defeating via defense. So they stopped attacking quite as hard and they started more just sort of like chilling and waiting for the other guy to run out of weapons and energy. So this is attrition warfare. And you may be sort of familiar with attrition warfare because it's actually a pretty common way to fight these days. And so basically the idea with attrition warfare is you just wear them down. You just wear them down. No more one giant battle, only endless, tiny, small battles. And this is, I think, kind of genius because it is really terrible. Like I would probably give up on the second week because I hate this kind of thing. But it's also very effective because of people like me who can't stand doing the same thing every day. So an endless series of small battles. So they would just like crawl forward, you know, 1,000 feet, fight, 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 crawl back 1,000 feet, fight, 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 all day, every day, for months, all winter. And so the other soldiers were just like, because this is, again, a really terrible way to fight. So this was working really well. And they combined this like, you know, sort of like death by 1,000 cuts with position warfare. So position warfare is the idea that you have to hold your ground. And you have to hold your ground at all costs. Like your position is the important thing. And position warfare killed a lot of men. Because sometimes, like you can see here, this is the battle outside of, God, I hate French so much. I can't pronounce French whatsoever. YPRES, Ypres. There's a noise that I can't make because French is the dumbest language. I said it. Okay, so basically they were fighting outside of Ypres, and they would just go back and forth 100 feet, 1,000 feet, nothing else. And they would like literally let all of their soldiers die over this 1,000 feet, even though it was just some guy's farm. So the idea was you are making a stance and you are saying something by holding on to your position. Not that the land itself was valuable, not that you were upholding some sort of valuable military base, just that you weren't allowing them to enter. So position warfare was very like sort of dominant, but not necessarily very effective in terms of like gaining land or gaining valuable stores, or like it was just sort of a way of sort of standing up. So again, this is very much like fighting via offense. Position warfare is like, no, you cannot come over here, and we will kill 10,000 boys in one day if that's what it takes. They did. So that was going pretty well. So Germany was like, oh, well, inventing new rules of war, going pretty well. We like this. So they decided to just keep pushing. So instead of the like ballet that we had seen earlier, where everybody takes turns, they started sort of expanding their repertoire. So they started engaging in what we call total war. So this means that they start to involve citizens and civilians. So traditionally in war, you are not supposed to involve civilians. This war is between your soldiers and our soldiers and nobody else. But we started to see a little bit of this with the Civil War, right? Remember we talked about Sherman's march to the sea? And then here we start to see the same thing again. So the Germans start to sort of lean in on their ideals. They start to lean in on this idea that not just French soldiers are bad, but French people are bad. And it's totally fine if we kill all of these people, even though they're not involved, because they are bad people. And bear in mind, it was really, really hard to get information at this point in time. So if the German government told you that something was true, you didn't really have any opposing information coming at you, and there was no way to find out different information. So when they sent out propaganda like this, which this one is gorgeous, but basically they're arguing like, you know, the only way to win is through like, you know, pure strength, like German, I don't know how to translate precisely, Greeks don't know how, like war power, like war god power, as you can see by this man clearly defeating this lion. So basically they started creating a lack of distinction. It was like, it's not the French soldiers are bad, it's that everyone is bad. And this allowed them to really fuck with the rules of war. So they started doing stuff that was unprecedented, but also like full-on illegal, because we had already agreed on the rules of war at Hague. And they were like, no, we're going to do something else. So they started doing the Kriegsverrat, which was basically when the civilians would try to participate. And sometimes the civilians did. Sometimes the civilians would come behind you and like literally burn the bridge, or the civilians would sneak out at night and feed the soldiers. So they started saying, if the civilians do this, we're not going to put them in prisoners of war camp. We're just going to kill them on the street. And they did. And then, of course, the Schrecklichkeit, which was frightening the civilians on purpose. So basically, the Germans stopped fighting the soldiers and started fighting the civilians. So they would do things like burning down libraries or bombing churches or orphanages at one point. That really did happen. And they're just like, they're killing a lot of unnecessary people. But they're doing this as a way of like disempowering the rest of the other countries. Like the other countries were shocked that they would do such a thing. So it became like a really depraved situation. And the Germans were basically trying to win at all costs, because they really thought that this was okay. They thought, we are on the side of right, and we're going to do whatever it takes to win. And that includes a bunch of like really questionable shit.
What I find interesting is Schrecklichkeit is literally just translates to ugliness. You know, Shrek literally just means ugly. So they were aware that what they're doing is like, you know, just really kind of fucked up, but they're like, it's okay. And I find that interesting. And like the words they use, you know, they're like full on admitting, yeah, this is pretty screwed up.
Yeah. That's why German is the best language, because they say what they mean and they pronounce all their letters.
Yeah, I think it.
But seriously, and the Kriegsrat is basically like a war system, like a war vengeance, kind of. So it's like this idea that everything that we do in war is okay. And so one of the things that they had to start doing, should sound familiar, which was just straight up denying that some stuff had happened. Like people would be like, hey, you bombed a library, you can't do that. And Germany's like, no, we didn't. No, we didn't. And everybody's like, Germany, like we saw you. Like we know that you did this. And Germany was just like, no, yeah, it's fake news. It's fake news for the French. They're trying to bring us down. And so basically they just started straight up denying the things that happened, or if that didn't work, just arguing that what they had done was morally correct. So whenever people were like, hey, you're not supposed to kill civilians, they were like, those civilians were bad. And it was a whole thing. They're basically like, look, isn't it better if we destroy a church than if they destroy even one of our soldiers? And so it's possible, right? The sort of reframing. It's possible to sort of argue that you're doing the right thing by bombing a church if you frame it as saving the life of a German soldier. So it's very clever, but it was also super evil, right? Which is going to be a recurring thing. So basically Germany was like fighting a war in a way that nobody had seen before, and also denying the bad parts. And again, stop me when this sounds familiar. So, I should point out, Britain also not that great. They weren't doing a lot of the stuff that Germany was doing, but they were also breaking some of the rules of war, especially in regard to their prisoners. So what people said at the time was Britain rules the waves, and thus Britain waves the rules, which meant that Britain had the best navy out of everybody, because they were an island, so they invented their navy way before almost anybody else invented their navy. So basically, they were super powerful, and that meant that they thought they could break the rules. So they weren't being cool, and neither were the French necessarily being cool, but nobody was on level with the Germans. Because the Germans tried to turn this back around. They're like, oh, what about the French? And everybody was like, yeah, Germany, they're not on level with you. So that was a problem. Okay, which leads us to tanks. Okay. Which leads us to the other thing. So one of the things we talked about in regard to militarism was that everybody had invented all these new toys. And this was really one of the big changes, because all of the stuff that we'd seen before, we have seen in other wars historically. Maybe not the two that we've talked about in class so far, but like there are other continents, right, that have been fighting wars too. And all of this had been done before. Total war had been done before. The breaking of the rules had been done before. Antagonizing civilians had been done before. But what they really start to do now is invent weapons. And the weapons make it really impersonal. So we start with tanks. So basically the Germans were like, all right, if we're going to fight in trenches, we need a way to like roll over top of the trenches, and we need a way to flatten the barbed wire. And it wouldn't suck if also we run over some soldiers. So they started inventing tanks, which was much harder than it sounds. The original tanks were kind of adorable. I'm super into this one on the top right for some reason. I don't know why, it's just so funny. Like, you invented a weapon of war and this is what you came up with? But to be fair, again, they're making this up as they go, and they need like all trained vehicles, which we never really had before. Like everybody else was like a horse and cart at this point, right? So they got some with big wheels. They got some with like this just one big tread. Like basically inventing tanks was a real challenge. But this was the first time that we'd seen tanks. So a person who's inside a tank is kind of impervious in a way that we hadn't seen before, right? Like we hadn't yet invented a bulletproof box, but once we put a man in a bulletproof box, like this is a game changer because you can't shoot him anymore and he can flatten you. So the tanks were a really big deal in terms of like efficiency in getting places and in staying unharmed. We also started to see like really fuck off big guns. So we saw that one earlier, right, that could shoot for 80 miles. And this is my personal favorite because her name is Big Bertha, which I don't know why, but that's really funny to me. So one of the things that the Germans invented that was kind of new was a way to fire guns. So if you think about the guns that we had previously, for the most part, you fired them like level. They are perpendicular to the ground, and they're supposed to go like through fences, and they're supposed to go through buildings and through soldiers. But what they invented with these guns, with the howitzers, was a way of sort of cranking up the nozzle so that it fired on a parabola. And what this meant was that you could shoot into a fort. Right? So instead of having to shoot through things, they could just shoot over things. So if you were inside a walled city, which a lot of Western Europe was, because walled cities had been perfectly effective for the last couple hundred years, now you could just shoot over the wall. So it was a really effective means of destroying the encampments that a lot of people had, because they didn't need to shoot through things anymore. They could just hop the fence. And also they invented really, really, really big mortars. So this was the first time that we started to see mortars that would explode on impact. So previously when you shot a cannonball or something like that, like the harm was done by the trajectory and the weight of the cannonball. But these are not only heavy and going real fast, when they land, they explode. So this was a game changer. Like you could really fuck up a lot of people with like one shot in a way that we had not seen before. So this is part of why it was so deadly. And also you could do it from really far away. We also, for the first time, had airplanes. So remember, airplanes had only kind of recently been invented. They essentially started in like the early 1900s, but remember, this is like 1918, 1917. So the airplanes, I cannot emphasize this enough, were basically tin cans. they're so small, and they're so delicate, and they had to figure out a way to make them really, really lightweight because they didn't have room for a big tank and they didn't have room for a lot of fuel. So they're made of aluminum, a lot of them. And as you can see, they're basically the size of like an Escalade. Maybe smaller. And so this was also brand new technology. So we started seeing airmen for the first time, and it was very cool. Like it was really, really cool to be a fighter pilot, but they had a very short lifespan. This is one of the things that we'll talk about when we talk about the movie. But most air pilots lasted about 18 hours, and then they died. So it wasn't a great system, but it was kind of exciting because, again, previously we hadn't had the ability to fight from the air. So now, instead of just facing each other on a level field, we can shoot over you and we can shoot down on you. So this is new. We're fighting in 3D now. The other thing that the Germans had recently not really invented but perfected was poison gas. So poison gas was illegal. At The Hague, they had decided, like, no, seriously, you can't do that. But what they wrote down was that you couldn't use poison or poisonous weapons. And so what a lot of people interpreted that to mean was, like, you can't stab somebody with a poisoned spear, or you can't, like, poison their whole water supply. So Germany was like, you didn't say anything about gas, which, come on, Germany, but they didn't. So Germany basically invented these diffusions. They invented poison gas, and so basically they were like, well, we didn't touch you, so, you know, and like, all right, you didn't. So here's some pictures of that. So basically, I love this guy's not even wearing a mask. So basically they would light these poisonous fires in these barrels and then wait for the wind to go the right way, and then the wind would carry the poisonous gas and it would carry it into the trenches because the gas was heavier than the surrounding air. So it was a very effective way to fight because you didn't need to shoot anybody, you didn't need to waste any bullets. You could just send this cloud out and then the cloud would kill people for you. But it was a terrible, terrible way to die. The chlorine gas that they were using was just a wretched way to die. So the Americans figured this out, and the British and the French, and they got these air masks here, which you've probably seen before. These are in a lot of museums. But you had to know the cloud was coming to put your mask on in time. So a lot of people died even though they had masks because they hadn't put it on in time. But we also had masks for the animals, and I just wanted to show you these because I thought they were funny. Look at that donkey. That's not going to work.
I actually didn't know we had the masks for the animals. I did not know that.
They didn't work very well. But
it made me feel, oh, that sucks. It made me feel better for a second, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the animals were really valuable. Like, you needed the animals to carry your stuff or to kill all your rats. So the animals were like treasured companions. So they built them their own little gas masks, which I think is so nice. All right. Oh, flamethrowers. So the Germans invented flamethrowers for this war. So the flamethrowers were pretty exciting for a minute. I don't know if you've ever seen a flamethrower in person. It's pretty epic. But it's also incredibly dangerous because you're basically carrying a backpack full of fuel. And so the Americans especially really quickly figured out that if you saw some guy with a flamethrower, all you had to do was shoot his backpack and he would explode. So they did that a lot. But basically the flamethrowers were considered like a cruel and unusual sort of means of warfare. Like, it was really, really frowned upon because, again, it's a terrible way to die. Getting burnt to death is a terrible way to die. So basically, people argued that that was, quote, unnecessary suffering and that the Germans shouldn't have done that, which is, again, kind of interesting, this idea that there are rules of war. Like, it's okay to shoot somebody, but not okay to flamethrower somebody. Like, okay. But they weren't ever used after this war on account of the explosion thing. But they were pretty popular there for a minute. And then, this is the biggest game changer, submarines. So again, previously we had been fighting on land where we could all see each other. And then we started flying in the air, which was new and sneaky. And then we started fighting under the water. So we had naval battles before. Like, this was not unusual. People have been having naval battles for hundreds of years. But what the Germans invented was these metal submarines. Americans had wooden submarines, which is kind of shocking, right? In the Civil War, like a wooden submarine. But the Germans invented metal submarines, and they started sneaking up on people. They started going, under the water, and they would sneak up on ships. And everybody else thought this was kind of immoral because, again, we had these rules of war. We're supposed to line up shoulder to shoulder and take turns shooting. Like, what the fuck are you doing, Germany? But again, Germany reinventing the rules. So they started sneaking up on people. They started, sinking all of the big battleships really quickly because ships at that time, especially, were not built for attack from below. They hadn't thought about that. So you could attack a ship from below kind of no problem because they hadn't been building it in regard to that. So they started really harassing Britain, especially because Britain had the best navy. And so what the German ships were doing was they were sort of cruising around in the ocean outside of Britain and shooting anybody who went by, which was a problem because one of the things that they shot was the Lusitania. So the Lusitania was one of our big American cruise ships. It was like a little bit, I'll show you the picture. A little bit smaller than the Titanic, but when it was built, it was the biggest ship anybody had ever seen. So it was 785 feet long, which to be fair is gigantic. So the Lusitania was on its way from America to England, and it was carrying a whole bunch of civilians. It was carrying some soldiers too, but mostly civilians, and the German U-boats bombed them. And so this was a problem because America was like, hey, that's us. Like, this is personal now, you know? And so they killed 120 Americans in addition to, like, you know, 1,100 other people. And America was like, all right, that's it. Like, it's personal now. We were staying out of it because we don't want any part in your war. We don't care what you people do, but you killed us. And now, buckle up, bitches. So America enters the chat. All right, so that's going to become relevant here in a minute. So now we'll talk about the soldiers. So we had not seen a war like this before. We had seen wars that went on for a really long time. We had seen wars that were fought in sort of miserable conditions, but we hadn't seen one like this before, especially with the amount of death and the quickness of death and like the horrible deaths that they were dying. But the weird thing was a lot of the soldiers stayed. So sometimes they were given leave, but they like almost always came back. There was almost no desertion. And this was kind of an unusual thing because we run out of professional soldiers. Like all of them had died in the first couple of months. So this is a bunch of like boys and old men, but they just kind of keep coming back. There were very few court martials, and they had this sort of like culture amongst themselves. So on the one hand, a lot of them were essentially running on autopilot because one of the things that they talk about, and they talk about this in the book that you're about to read, is that sometimes it's easier not to think about what you're doing. So it was hard, I think, to wake up and be like, all right, I'm going to have my breakfast and then I'm going to go kill some dudes. So instead, they would just sort of like shut down, just sort of run entirely on autopilot, just do whatever the commanders told them to do, and like sort of try not to think about what was happening to them and what was happening to their enemies and what the like impact of this was going to be. So basically, because everything was so regimented, you didn't really have to participate mentally. You could just turn off. So what a lot of soldiers did was they just sort of shut down. So they would just sort of run on autopilot and they would just do whatever they were told. And it was not a great way to live, but probably a great way to survive, if that makes sense. One of the things that they said was the moment had come when it was unwise to think. So on the one hand, a lot of them are like sort of turning off their cognitive abilities. On the other hand, some of them are turning off their cognitive abilities because they're suffering. So we didn't yet have a word for PTSD, but essentially what they described was the state approaching narcosis, which meant that a lot of the soldiers were just so horrified by what they'd seen that they just kind of went comatose. And that's not unusual. Like this is a very like common flight or fight response. Like a lot of humans, when they see something or something happens to them that is really epically bad, they just sort of curl in and shut down. That's really common. So they started to call it shell shock. And the idea was that you had seen so much shelling that you were shocked by it. And so if you ever read about people coming home from World War I with shell shock, that's kind of what it was. They called it neurasthenia for a little while too, but like shell shock was a lot easier. These days, we call it PTSD, but we didn't necessarily have a word for that in World War I or in World War II or in the Vietnam War. Like we essentially ignored this problem up until very, very recently. And we're still by and large ignoring it. But the horrors of war were something that people were really starting to experience on a grand scale for the first time. Because remember, like especially the German boys, they had seen 1 million of their friends die in the first couple of months. By this point in the war, by a couple years in, like everybody had seen millions of their friends die. So it was like a really charged battlefield, but also like a really depressed battlefield. But the military didn't care about that. They basically just told them to man up. And so often they would just sort of, again, deny that it was happening. Like it was sort of a fake news thing. So people were like, hey, this guy needs to go on leave. Like he's just been crying in the corner for 4 days. They were like, nah, he's fine. So one of the ways that they tried to deal with this was by ignoring it. And we're going to see what happens when that, backfires later. So the other thing is that often going through something really, really terrible together unifies you. So the soldiers were, in a lot of ways, so attached to one another. Like these were their best friends, these were their battle mates, these were their compatriots, and that's part of why they didn't leave. And it wasn't because they thought the war was a good idea. It was because they couldn't leave their friends there by themselves. So even if they were given leave, usually they would come back. And that wasn't because of like their noble, goals. It wasn't because like Germany over all this. It was because they couldn't leave their friends there without them. Like they felt guilty about it. And again, that's very human and really kind of admirable. So the soldiers really loved each other, and they like became really tight units. And this was really important again after the war, because they couldn't really talk to anybody else about what they'd seen. Because like if you've never seen someone die from chlorine gas, like how are you going to chat about that at dinner, So the unification of the soldiers was actually vital.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is it comradeship or camaraderie?
Yep, I think in English it's camaraderie. Did I type comradeship? I probably did. I think I was translating it from German. My bad. You're correct. It's camaraderie.
Okay,
My bad. I'll go back and change the slide. So part of this for the soldiers was that they were tightly bound to one another, and they like really believed that they were doing the right thing, but they were mad at the civilians because as far as they could tell, the civilians weren't doing anything. The civilians were just like at home eating bonbons and like chilling. And so the soldiers became a sort of an us and them argument. So the soldiers got really mad when people would complain about food shortages, and they had a really hard time like when they would go home and people would try to like share the news from home because they were like, I don't care about this, like do you not understand what I just saw when I was there? So this was a really, really hard thing for the soldiers to kind of go through. And also there were a lot of people at home who were sort of like armchair quarterbacks who were looking at what was going on in the war, and they were like, well, you're doing it wrong. It's your problem. So for the soldiers, it was a very tricky place to be in. There were like 4 or 5 guys who understood them, and everybody else had no idea what they were going through, and some of them were being kind of shitty about it. So this is another one of the glorious posters from the American Army, which is meant to be sort of guilting the civilians. And this one says, even a dog enlist, why not you? That dog does look very brave. So part of the problem for the soldiers, and part of the problem with like the war effort itself, was that there was a very, very limited amount of information that everybody was allowed to have. So there was a lot of propaganda, and there was a lot of outright lies. So the soldiers themselves were told what the army wanted them to know. There weren't newspapers, there weren't radios, there certainly wasn't any internet, there wasn't like cell phones. So the only source of information that you had was what the higher ups told you. So often the higher ups used this to just straight up lie. For months and months, they would just tell them like, oh, it's going great. Almost no one died. We're making great progress, and the soldiers didn't know because they didn't leave the same like 3 square miles for 3 months, So the propaganda was itself extraordinarily powerful, not just for the soldiers, but for the people at home, because the people at home really didn't know what was happening, right? Because if they're fighting in Britain and in Germany, or sorry, if they're fighting in France and Germany, but you're in Britain, you have no way of knowing what's going on. So basically the censorship was incredibly powerful. Both sides lied to their civilians, and both sides lied to their soldiers, because there was no other way for them to like hear what might be going on. So this poster is for the Allies, but I think it's kind of great. The web is spun for you with invisible threads. So the question is who you should talk to about wartime maneuvers and battles and where you're going to go, because the idea was everyone is a spy. And there were some spies, to be sure. But also the conspiracy theories make people bound together a little bit more. Like people who believe the same conspiracy theory tend to be like a lot, sort of more tighter, like more tightly woven. And then also it helps to sort of keep spirits buoyed, because they sincerely thought that things were happening that weren't happening. And this was also true for the civilians. All right, so I told you there'd be a lot of information, so I apologize for this. But all right, so we're going to back up, and we're not at the war site any longer. We're going to look at sort of what's going on in the rest of the world. So the civilians had no idea what was happening in the war. They were told little bits of things, and they would get letters from their soldiers who were at the war, but for the most part, they were sort of like fighting their own thing. So there's a lot of really gorgeous propaganda. I'm super into propaganda. One of the things that I think is really interesting that we're going to see repeatedly is this sort of depiction of Germans as Huns. And so the Huns were sort of like essentially like an ethnic group that was like in the land between like East Europe and Russia. Like I'm not going to get too far into it, but basically you've probably heard of Attila the Hun, and he was a great soldier, but a very scary dude. So they started just sort of labeling all the Germans as Huns, which was a really interesting move. And so whenever you see art like this, that's kind of what they're going for here. So as you can see, he's very scary. And the best way to defeat them is Liberty bonds, which is when you loan the government some money, and then ideally the government pays you back later with a little bit of interest. Do they pay you back? We'll talk about that later. So this is for, for the Red Cross, to help people. And I think this one is especially good. Women of Britain say go. So like essentially the argument is, the women want you to go to war, and if you don't go to war, it's because you're a pussy little bitch, which was a very powerful argument, right? So the civilians were kept totally in the dark for the most part. This is an example of a war letter from World War I that's pretty heavily censored. So they literally went through with like black pens and just marked out anything they thought would be dangerous in some regard, especially any mention of place or any mention of specific names, because they didn't want letters going home that indicated where the soldiers were. So you had to write these like super vague letters or else they would get censored all to hell. The newspapers, remember, not allowed to publish pictures of dead soldiers anymore. So even though there were photographers there were photographs of this war, after the Civil War, they realized that they didn't want civilians to know what the war looked like. So they didn't publish any pictures. They didn't publish any like numbers of how many people were dying. So people would get letters if your person died, but we didn't know that thousands and thousands and thousands of people were dying. They didn't tell anybody how often people were dying or how they died. So basically, the information that got back to civilians was very, very limited. So what the civilians were doing was essentially trying to support the soldiers, but like from over here. So in a lot of countries, what happened was essentially state control of the government. So the state took control of all of the things. This is very kind of communist, but we didn't use that word yet. But they would control the economy, and you had to have a passport, and there was very little traveling, and you had to have your papers, and all of the rationing of food and supplies. This is one of those things that has struck me in the last couple of months, because you read about, going to the store and there's no flour or sugar or something like that, and then in the last couple of months you would go to the store and there's no like toilet paper or yeast, and I was like, oh, it's like rations. So it was a very strict control of what was available to buy and how much it cost, and they started making everybody go to work. So on the one hand, this is really good. Women started entering the workplace for the first time. They started like gaining skills and earning money. On the other hand, this was kind of bad because a lot of industries were just shut down, and all of that energy was funneled into other stuff. So like a factory would be shut down and then start making supplies for the war instead. So the government really took over the social world. They took over the economy. They basically argued that because we are at war, you should stop being a person and start being, like a patriot. So again, here's some more beautiful propaganda. This one is from the United States as well. And it says that the best way that you can stand by the boys in the trenches is to mine more coal. Again, a solid argument. They did need a lot of fuel, but it's just sort of an example of the way that they're saying the war is more important than you, and the soldiers are the best possible people, so you need to do what you can do, in this case, work 14-hour shifts. And here, just because I can't help myself, a little bit more propaganda. But I thought some of these might be interesting to you, because basically a lot of these, they're trying to guilt the civilians for consuming supplies. Because what they want to do is save a lot of these supplies and send them to the soldiers. So we're going to see this again in World War II. But as you can see, like for instance, they want people to eat more cottage cheese because they want to send the meat to the front. Or they want you to eat less sugar because they want to send all of that to the front. Or here's all of the people, gathering wheat. And so I think it's kind of interesting. It's basically this idea of like, what can you as a person do to help the war effort? And for the most part, it was down to like food and supplies. Meatless days, wheatless days. Fascinating. Americans, as you may have noticed, don't go through this anymore. Americans are much too selfish these days. They won't even wear masks. But this is sort of, at the time, it was very much a community effort. It was this idea that we can help by doing this thing. So basically, the civilians at home are mostly in the dark. Nobody's telling them anything, and they're trying to help by doing what they can do to help, which is largely diet-related. All right, back to the front. So it's a couple of years into the war, and it's not going like anybody thought it would go. Basically, trench warfare, a total loss, everybody died. Submarine warfare, more successful, but not ideal. And so Germany's having a really hard time. And all of the German citizens especially are looking at this, and they're like, hey, y'all said this war would be over. And Germany's like, oh, here's what we'll do. We'll just change our leadership. Like, no problem. Probably, they think, the problem is these guys at the top. So, like, we're going to fire both of them and replace them with new people. So they got a new imperial counselor and a new foreign minister. And the issue with these two guys was that they were both real scary, like just full-on fascists. But fascists are very appealing when you're at war, right? Because they say all of the war things. So they basically just, well, not really elected, but like placed two super fascist dudes in control, and Wilhelm was still there, but people are really starting to lose hope in Wilhelm. He's just too dramatic, and he's just too useless, and it's pretty clear that he's really bad at leading because he surrounds himself with yes man sycophants, and then it turns out they're bad at what they do, and then the whole economy crumbles, and then the whole war crumbles. So basically they tried to bring in these two dudes to kind of like shore up their effort. But no, didn't work. So basically everybody else is feeling a little bit strengthened at this point, especially because Germany is kind of in shambles and they don't know what's going on. And so Germany is fighting on two fronts. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire is helping a little bit. But they're fighting on the Western Front, they're fighting on the Eastern Front, they're surrounded, they're running out of weapons, they're running out of food, they're running out of soldiers. Like, it's just kind of a shitty time to be Germany. They went into this war thinking it would be real fast, and when it was not fast, it was a real problem. So basically they're sort of stalling out. Kind of, they were always going to lose, but whatever. So that's when they really get fucked over by America, in the most patriotic way possible, right? So America didn't enter this war initially. We didn't want to. Like, this was not our problem. And Woodrow Wilson was like, why don't y'all just solve your own problem? Like, we're over here, you know? But when they bombed the Lusitania, it was like, fine. And to be fair, Americans do kind of love war. So Americans did get kind of worked up about this. Not everybody wanted to go. It was actually a really unpopular decision at first. Everybody was like, we don't want our people to die about this. But Woodrow Wilson talked him into it. And when the Americans came, they came in strong. I mean, they were sending 10,000 men a day to the front. And if you can imagine, if you've been at war for 3 years and you have trench foot and you're wet and you're cold and you're malnourished, and then thousands of like bright, young, strong Americans show up every day, it was very encouraging. It brought this like new life to the Allied forces, and they were like, oh shit, maybe we will win. And the Americans brought a bunch of planes, and they brought a bunch of bullets, and they brought a bunch of food, and they basically just like bred new life into this war effort. So the Germans were getting exhausted and running out of supplies at exactly the same time that the Allies were getting like refreshed and sort of plumped up. So this one is my personal all-time favorite propaganda poster. As you can see, it's a German Hun who for some reason looks like a gorilla, probably because of racism. And he's holding this woman, and basically this art became later King Kong. Hopefully you guys have seen King Kong. And then we've seen versions of this piece of art over and over and over. There's a really famous magazine cover that got in a lot of trouble for that. But basically this is the US Army. Basically the gorilla is stealing the white woman, and we have to go help. Propaganda. So everybody in America is like, all right, fine, like, we'll do it. And they go to war. They send about 4 million men ultimately to war. The American women go into the factories. The American children do scrap drives. Like, America participates, which leads us to the end of the war. So technically, the war ended with the armistice. So the armistice itself was on 11/11/11/11/11/11, lots of 11s. Basically, it was November 11th at 11:11 a.m. They signed it early that morning, but whatever. That's what counts. So the armistice was basically everybody agreed to just put their guns down. It wasn't the official end of the war, but everybody agreed to stop shooting each other. So they published it. Here you can see the headlines from the Washington Times: "War is over." And the idea with the armistice was that they were going to end fighting on land and sea and air. And we didn't have a Space Force yet, so that was everybody. So the problem with the armistice was that it was meant to be temporary. It was basically like, look, we're going to put down our guns until the generals decide what we're going to do. So the armistice only lasted 36 days, which was a problem because after the armistice, all the soldiers were like, yeah, we're out. So they had to just keep renewing it, and eventually they got their shit together, but not for 7 months. And then they signed the Treaty of Versailles. So you've probably heard of the Treaty of Versailles because, you know, it has its epic place in history. But basically, they didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles until 1919, which was, again, so long after the armistice. So after the armistice, everybody just sort of sat around for a long time. But basically, I'll come back to this, but let me show you this. These are the big four guys that were there. So we've got the Prime Minister of France, that's Clemenceau. We got the Prime Minister of Italy, Orlando. We got the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, which is not their king, but like, you know, sort of their head government guy. And then, of course, our President Woodrow Wilson. So they got together behind closed doors. They weren't at Versailles. I don't know why they call it this, but whatever. And they decided what would have to happen. And so basically they got together and signed this, and then a larger war council signed it and like made it official. But here's essentially what they decided. They said, listen, Germany, you have to admit that you were wrong and you were bad and you have to give us a bunch of money. And so basically, Germany had to give up certain parts of their territory. They had to give up the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? But like that doesn't exist anymore. And they had to pay reparations. And so the reparations in today's money came out to 31 billion, which isn't possible, right? Like, so this was a problem, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But basically, the rules for ending the war were Germany had to like apologize and give everybody a bunch of money and disarm themselves. So, Treaty of Versailles, everybody hated it. And to be fair, like always with a compromise, everybody hates the compromise because you're giving up things that you wanted and you're agreeing to things that you didn't want. So like the war ended and they signed this and they all went home, but everybody was like, you know, because the Allies thought it was too gentle, the Entente thought it was too harsh, like, I mean, it was or back and forth like that sort of. So basically, everybody was mad. So the war's over, but everybody is like grumpy and they're cold and everybody's dead and they're suddenly really poor. And so the period after the war is actually kind of vital. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this, especially because of how it starts to set up the next World War, but I just think it's important to talk about what happened afterwards. So that was technically the end of the war, but then everybody starts coming home. And coming home was the really, really hard part for the soldiers because they get home and for one thing, nobody understands what they've been through. Nobody understands like what's going on mentally with them, what's going on physically with them. Also, there's a massive pandemic happening. Again, that might sound familiar. 9 million people had died and 21 million wounded. And it might be more than 9 million. That was just the soldiers. Like how many civilians died, we don't even know. So the problem was that even though both sides went into this war thinking like, oh, we're going to win, and we're going to conquer, and we're going to bring the world our values, they didn't. Like it ended, and technically the Allies won, but they didn't conquer. They didn't take over territories. They didn't spread their vision. They didn't like bring democracy. Like they just sort of ended. And so everybody was really disillusioned, and everybody was really sort of unhappy, and we'll be a little bit more cheerful after World War II because we really decisively sort of won that one and defeated like the bad guy. But after World War I, everybody was like, so the veterans were in an especially bad place. A lot of them were injured in ways that we hadn't seen people be injured before. We'd gotten better at infections and we'd gotten better at surgery, so more people survived than would have in previous wars. But that just meant they went home broken. So that was really, really hard. And it was hard for the veterans to survive in the world after that because we didn't have GI Bills yet. We didn't invent that until World War II. So we didn't have hospitals for them. We didn't have jobs for them. We didn't have programs for them. So a lot of them came home and couldn't do their old jobs. So by merit of fighting in this war, they were now permanently unemployed. So for the veterans, it was pretty shitty. For the civilians, a lot of them reacted by just going buck wild. They were like, you know, that war was terrible. We didn't have any sugar. We weren't allowed to like do anything fun. We weren't allowed to go out. And also at this point, again, the pandemic had just ended. So we're going to do this again here in a minute. And so they just like launched headfirst into this like really hedonistic period in history. So this is the Roaring 20s. We stole jazz from Black people. That was very successful. We started wearing skirts above our knees. Super slutty. People started drinking. They were smoking. There were jazz cigarettes. Like it was a major thing. It was a whole thing. So basically people had gone through this like terrible spiritual crisis and then they got like set free and they were like, wah! And they just kind of went nuts for a little while. Only for a little while, you know what happens next. But again, this is, I think, something that's going to happen here in the next year or two. I think we're going to have another Roaring 20s as soon as we're finished with our pandemic. In the political world, all of the men who had started this war were tossed. All of the civilians were like, y'all, that was stupid. And we don't want you here anymore. So basically all of these dudes got sort of like forced into retirement or they got voted out of office. Wilhelm just had to leave and go into hiding, and he was so sad that he stopped doing his mustache and it started drooping, which for some reason is hilarious to me, but I don't know why. So basically they replaced them with a lot of dudes who unfortunately were kind of scary. They were leftist, which like, all right, like socialism, etc., but they were leftist fascists. So it started going in a real dark direction. So in Germany, we're about to see this, the Social Democrats, which is a hilarious name because, anyway, we'll talk about that later. So the voters essentially were just so disillusioned that they wanted new ideas. They wanted a whole new form of government. They wanted a whole new life. And so they just full force threw those old dudes away and replaced them with new dudes. So this is, again, something that's sort of similar to what you're going to see in your book. And I apologize for the wall of text, but basically this is from a soldier who got home and was sort of like reflecting on his experience. And he said that basically any intelligent undergraduate, which is you, could interpret this war and would arrive at the conclusion that our entry into the war was a blunder. My generation was betrayed, swindled, exploited, and decimated by its elders. Strong words, right? But you kind of can't blame them. Like, they were sold this false war. They thought it would be over quite quickly. They thought it would be over and then they would like take over the rest of the world. They thought they would get glory. They thought it would like change things for the better. And instead they just mostly died and then came home. So it was the first time that I think we really started to kind of look back at the war and be like, oh wait, that was dumb. And we're going to see this again very heavily in your book. So keep this quote in mind. So the other thing that starts to happen is Germany is sent home like all embarrassed with their little tail between their legs, and they get home and they're like, you know, the reparations we think are stupid, and also we still think that Germany is amazing, and maybe the problem is that we are amazing and everyone else is jealous. Again, this should start to sound familiar. So basically they wanted to become strong again. So they started to lean on a really nationalistic identity, and they started to tell themselves that like, Germany is great. They're just trying to hold us down. And probably the people who are trying to hold us down are communists and Jews. And so basically they started saying what we need to do is create a new, strong, perfect form of Germany. We need to create this like master race, right? So they said they were going to create a new type of human being from whom would spring a new morality, a new social system. This is him on the right. You can tell by how blonde he is. But this is a sort of an ad for like the student branch of the Nazis, which at the time, super normal. There were like children's branches of the Nazis, there were student branches, there were women's branches, like everybody joined because they made these big speeches about things that they were like, oh, we're gonna make it better, or like, we're gonna make Germany great again. You may be familiar with this dude. So Adolf Hitler actually fought in World War I. He was on the front lines, like he had some experience with this war. And so in that sense, he knew that it was kind of a shit show, and that's why he did the Second War differently. But also he knew what the civilians were mad about. And he understood that they were having this like identity crisis, and that they were afraid for the future, and that they wanted to like bring back their former glory. And so he started really leaning on all of that. He started doing like a lot of fear mongering. He started doing a lot of propaganda. And so basically, he was a huge hit. And to be fair, you should go back and watch one of his speeches. He's a very engaging speaker. He was really, really good at that part. He was deeply evil, like no lie, obviously, but still, in the beginning, he was a really, really charismatic leader. So when he got elected to the Chancellor of Germany, this was in 1933, people were excited. People were super excited. 25,000 people in the streets. And he said the things that they wanted to hear him say. He talked about how the war wasn't going to be in vain, and how we didn't kill all of those young boys for no reason, and how we were going to honor their sacrifices, and we were going to like rise up and be stronger. And they started, oh, this is him making speeches. He was really good at hand gestures. And they started heavy fear mongering. So this part should sound very familiar too. He started telling the Germans, people are coming for you. And they're going to destroy your culture, and they're going to destroy your history, and they're going to sleep with your women. That's always a concern. And they're going to like make you be subservient. So they started this like epic fear-mongering campaign where they were like, the Jews are coming for you, and they're gonna take your women, and they're gonna take all your money, and they're gonna like make you forget all the songs you used to sing, and they're probably gonna take away Christmas. And like it didn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but it was scary for these people who had just been told that they were responsible for an entire world war, and that they were never gonna rebuild their country the way that they thought that they would. So all of these people, and again, this should sound familiar, were used to being powerful, and then we're starting to see other people get powerful, and then they got scared. And so they believed a man who lied to them and told them that he would bring them back to power.
Do you know how they like came to get the swastika? Because isn't the swastika like originally like a Buddhist symbol? So how did that like? Do you know how that came into? They
straight up stole it. Basically, one very good thing I can say about the Nazis was that they were great at symbolism, super, super good at propaganda. So basically they wanted something that could be reproduced really, really easily and recognizable from far away. So they wanted something that was black on white and that could be like reproduce, no problem. So they had to have a simple symbol. So basically they took the Hindi symbol and turned it sideways and called it throne. But they did that a lot. They took the eagle, they took the olive branches, they took the whole red on black scheme. Basically, they took anything that they thought might be visually impactful and then just reproduced it in mass and put it everywhere. But yeah, it is kind of a shame that they took that symbol that had meant so many other things and then made it evil. They tilted it, but like that's all. So basically, as you can see in this poster, the very strong blonde German man is being threatened by these short, ugly people. The nerve, right? So basically, they emphasized the emotional aspects. They were like, isn't it scary how people are coming for us? And the people were like, it is scary. Like, you make a great point. And so they built this whole sort of like national identity around like the things that Germany could be. So basically, they were mad because they lost the war and they thought that they should have won the war. So they just sort of like went into hiding for a minute and like licked their wounds and got ready to reemerge as a world power again. I thought this meme was kind of great. Everybody's like, oh, we're at peace. And Germany's like they're coming for a sequel. So basically, this was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Like it was called the Great War. Like it was supposed to be like our only world war. It was supposed to like end everything. But instead, because of that compromise, it made Germany really, really mad. And you know what happens next because you probably read that part in history. So, World War I. That was really long. I'm so sorry. Do you have any questions?
That was interesting.
Good. Yeah, I think it's helpful to talk about the social aspects instead of like the dates and times because you know that part already, or someone told you that part already, or if you would like to know it, the History Channel.
You just taught me a lot. I don't know about the other people, but thank you.
You are welcome. It is my job and also my life's work. Okay, so with all of that knowledge in your heads, I think that the movie is going to make a lot more sense and the book is going to make a lot more sense. So don't forget that your book is a novel, so you do have to read this one start to finish, but it's one of the all-time great novels, and I think that secretly you will like it. And don't forget to go ahead and watch the movie tonight. It's not at all painful. Well, that was not a glowing endorsement. Secretly it's really good, and everybody in it is incredibly good looking. And so I think you'll like it. I think you will secretly like it. So what we'll do tomorrow is we'll come back and we'll talk about this weird movie and all the people who were in it and all the airplanes that were in it. And then we will be prepared to talk some more about World War I. Any pressing questions before we disband into the world? All right. Well, send me emails if you have questions. And other than that, go home, think about war, and I will see you again in the morning.
Bye.